Certainly it's good to be with you tonight, and I'm sure, as Billy already mentioned, you've been wished a happy Mother's Day. If you haven't, happy Mother's Day to you. Mother's Day has always been a little bit bittersweet for me the last several years. It was 8 years ago on a Sunday. We lived in Owensboro, Kentucky at the time, and I had just preached that morning in Rockport, Indiana, and had gotten word that my mother had taken a turn for the worse. She had been in the ICU for about 30 days in Indianapolis, and so we hurried up to Indianapolis, and she passed away a couple hours after midnight on Mother's Day. And it seems hard to believe it was 8 years ago, but my mother instilled great values in me and helped me achieve a faith in God that I hold dear to this day. And she was very instrumental in that. And so I think it's really fitting today as we think about mothers and we think about fathers and parents and faith. There's a very relevant question. Will our children know God? That question is a very real question to me. It's not a casual question. In fact, I really can't think of a more important question. Will our children know God? My heart was touched as my children grew up and they said for the first time words like Bible and Jesus and God and the church. We want what's best for our children. We want them one day to have faith in God. And so what can we do to ensure that years from now, our children will in a deeply and personal way really know God? I hope that the children that are here tonight and the children that may not be here tonight will one day be able to say what a 10-year-old once wrote to God. This is what he wrote. Dear God, I love you more than anybody else that I do not know. I hope our children can have that kind of faith. Children, especially small children, are in those very tender and vital early stages of faith development. Ideas, words, feelings, and images are literally flooding through their receptors into a reservoir from which they will later grapple with some of the most profound issues of life. Issues like trust and courage, hope, responsibility, justice, mercy, and love. These truly are formative years for our young people. In our home, not just as a preacher, but as a Christian, in our home, we talk a lot about God. We talk a lot about Jesus. We talk a lot about church. That's part of what we do. I know that one day my sons, if not already, will know plenty about God. But I want them one day to really know God on their own. I want them to not have just an inherited faith, but a deeply internalized faith that is truly their own. And so naturally tonight, as we begin this discussion, will our children know God? It's obvious that it really starts where? It starts at home, doesn't it? When George Gallup asked Americans about religious training for their children, 86% answered, yes, I want my children to receive religious instruction. Now that was a few years ago, but even recent polls indicate that in the 80s, 86, 89% of Americans still want their children to have religious training. That seems kind of odd, doesn't it, when you consider our society today? In fact, 3/4 of non-church-going Americans surveyed said they wanted their children to receive religious instruction. In 2007, there was a study done of university professors across the United States. And if you know anything about university professors at secular institutions, most of them have pretty liberal thought processes. Many of them are agnostic or atheistic in their belief system. But yet, this amazes me, 73% of faculty in American colleges and universities said they wanted their children to receive religious training. We all, both the churched and the unchurched, want our children to have faith in God. At least there seems to be a belief out there that we want our children to have a fair opportunity to choose faith. In fact, recently I was reading a blog of someone who is a young mother. She is an atheist, does not believe in God, but in this blog she indicated she wanted her child to have the opportunity to choose faith or not faith, but she wanted to give him that opportunity. That's kind of interesting to me. So, how do we go about it? A wise old minister was asked when parents should begin teaching the Bible to their children. And this is what he answered. About 20 years before they're born. And I hope you understand what he was saying. The first stage of our children's faith development is really our faith development. So let's get the obvious out on the table. As far as our children are concerned, we parents are the earliest and most influential arguments for or against authentic faith. It's about us. It really is. It's not about the preacher. It's not about the Bible school teacher. It's not about the teacher at school. It's not about their peers. It really is about us as parents. Children have a way, don't they, of being able to tell the authentic from the phony. And we can really fool a lot of people outside of our home. But the children who are in our home, they know, don't they? They know what kind of faith we really have or do not have. Now, they don't necessarily need us to be walking Bible encyclopedias or some great theological expert who can answer any kind of esoteric question about God. They need to know that God is real to us and that God is important. They need to know that when something comes on television that's not suitable for the family to watch, that we turn the channel. They need to know that when we're in the car and a song comes on the radio that has questionable lyrics, that we turn it off or turn the station. We think they're not listening. We think they're not watching, but what? They are. They are. We need to watch our own language. We need to make sure we don't take God's name in vain. We need to make sure that we don't curse in our homes. They need to see us praying to God. They need to see us reading our Bibles. They need to see us out on the deck watching the sunset and saying, "Isn't God great? Isn't God great?" Faith development begins at home. It was true in the Old Testament with the Jewish nation. Turn, if you will, to a passage I know is familiar to you. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. Here we have a new generation of Israel. The old generation of Israel, because of their unbelief, had died in the wilderness, not able to enter into the promised land. And so here we have Israel gathered on the plains of Moab to hear Moses prepare them to read the law as they went into a foreign nation. Look at verses 1 and 2. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the judgments which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you are going over to possess it, so that you and your son and your grandson might fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. You see, Jewish parents didn't just talk about God or live godly on special high and holy days. This was to happen every day in their home. And Moses was reminding them, listen, you're going to go into this Canaanite land. And the people all around you, they're not going to share your values. They're not going to share your beliefs. They're going to be antagonistic to faith. And so I need you in your homes with your children and with your families daily, reminding them about me. Reminding them about what it means to be a follower of God. Reminding them about the law. Kind of sounds like our culture, doesn't it? We need to do the same thing. Look at verses 6 and 7. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You need to be talking about God and spiritual things all the time in your home. That needs to be commonplace. Not just getting ready for Wednesday night services or getting ready for Sunday morning services or just when we arrive here. Producing faith is not just an Easter or Christmas thing, right? That's what a lot of people in our world say, and we can see where they are in their faith development, right? There are 50 other weeks, right? There are 363 other days, or this year there are 364 other days, right? The most indelible lessons of life and faith are learned not in the classroom, but at home. So, it begins at home, but guess what? It's nurtured by the church. It's nurtured by the church. Spiritual development begins at home, but I'm here to tell you, and I think you'll agree, parents need help, don't we? Parents need help. And you know what? We cannot look to the public schools to teach the Christian faith. You know why? It's outlawed there. It's outlawed there. So we can't look to the school system to teach it. We certainly cannot depend upon the American culture to build religious belief. Our culture is composed of secular values, violence, brutality, unhealthy lifestyles. William Willimon, in his book Christian Century, tells the story of a Sunday evening back in 1963 when he and several of his church friends skipped church to join John Wayne, the Duke, at Greenville, South Carolina's Old Fox Theater. The Fox, in defiance of the state's blue laws, was open on Sunday for the first time ever. And this is what he writes about that event. That evening symbolizes a watershed in the history of Christianity in the United States. On that night, Greenville, South Carolina, the last pocket of resistance to secular living in the Western world, gave in and served notice that it would no longer be a prop for the church. If Christians were going to be made in Greenville, then the church must do it alone. The Fox went head to head to see who would provide ultimate values for the young. Society is not just neutral about faith development, it is against faith development. So many things in our world go against and compete with our children's values. Blue laws, right? They don't hardly even exist anymore. Some of you remember blue laws, right? I remember when we were in college at Freed-Hardeman that they wanted to build a Walmart somewhere in West Tennessee. And the Walmart would not come to town because of regulations about how often they could be open on a Sunday, because we had these blue laws. So they changed the blue laws so the Walmart would come to town. things of the past. So the schools aren't going to teach it. Society isn't going to teach it. So it falls upon the church, right, as it should, to teach the values. C. Ellis Nelson, a former leader in religious education, says that the fate of the next generation's faith lies largely with the church, the community of faith development, where faith is expressed and taught in, number one, the story it tells, the events it experiences together, and finally, the relationships that it shares. And so, with the balance of the time that we have tonight, I want to look briefly at these three areas, and then the lesson will be yours. So, the story the church tells. If you have not done this in a while, and maybe your kids are grown, you don't have little kids anymore, I want to encourage you sometime, maybe even after services tonight, to go into the little kids' classrooms and just look on the walls and just look at the bulletin boards and look at the items that are in those classrooms. Take a journey sometime. When I do that, it brings back wonderful memories. Remember flannel boards? When that was the big thing, flannel boards in Bible school, attendance charts, Bible games, memorizing scriptures, walking through a Bible classroom and smelling clay because they've been using clay to make figures in class. In these classrooms, every Sunday morning and every Wednesday night, our children are learning their history. They're learning their identity in those classrooms. They're pivotal. There is no more delight or no better effective way to teach faith than through stories. We all love stories. I was fortunate. I went to a Christian school from kindergarten to 8th grade that was associated with the Church of Christ in Indianapolis. And I'll never forget, 4th or 5th grade, we had an older lady who was retired, and she would come and read stories to us. Her name was Margaret Stern. She was a member of the Southeastern Church of Christ. She would come in and read stories so our teacher could take a break and have her prep time. She would read stories like Little House on the Prairie or Tales of a 4th Grade Nothing. She drove a yellow Nova. I remember those stories that she told. Once upon a time in a land far away. Most of the stories that she told were fictional stories. They were tales. They were fables. But the stories that are told in the classrooms in this building are inspired. They're factual, and they're true, and they're just as amazing. And teachers often bring these stories to life. Noah and the ark, David and Goliath, Samson and Delilah, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, Daniel in the lion's den, Jonah and the big fish, Jesus as a baby, Jesus on the cross, Jesus in the grave, Jesus being resurrected. We have godly men and women who are teaching these lessons to our children throughout the week. These Bible stories tell us about our God. They tell us about us. We need to hear them over and over again. Turn again to Deuteronomy chapter 8 this time, beginning in verse 11. Deuteronomy 8, beginning in verse 11. And notice what Moses says here. Beware, lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his ordinances and his statutes, which I am commanding you today. Lest when you have eaten and are satisfied and have built good houses and lived in them, once you've arrived in the land of Canaan and you've settled it, and when your herds and your flocks multiply and your silver and gold multiply and all that you have multiplies, then your heart becomes proud and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. He led you through the great and terrible wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water. He brought water for you out of the rock of flint. In the wilderness he fed you manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you to do good for you in the end. Otherwise, you may say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth. Verse 18, but you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who is giving you the power to make wealth, that he may confirm his covenant which he swore to your fathers, as it is to this day. And then finally, verse 19, and it shall come about, if you ever forget the Lord your God, and go after other gods, and serve them and worship them, I testify against you today that you shall surely perish. What is Moses saying here? You got to know your story. If you don't know your story, if you don't know your history, you'll become proud one day and you'll forget it all and you'll think it all came by your own hand. Our children must know their story if they're to have faith. And so, what are the events the church experiences together? Our children need to share meaningful events with us at church. Now, Jesus, as a Jewish boy, grew up in a religious world filled to the brim with feast and fast and festivals, traditions, observances, sacrifices, and pilgrimages. I must assume that he intended the observances of the church he founded to be somewhat simpler, in light of the fact that amidst all the religious events of the first century, he ordained only 5 acts of worship and only 1 rite of passage, baptism. We read about singing in Ephesians 5:19, praying in Ephesians 6:18, giving in 1 Corinthians 16:1 and 2, communing, 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 29, preaching, 2 Timothy 4 and verse 2. So let's talk about those for just a moment. We sang tonight. Carter led us in our singing. I remember when I was little and I couldn't read, I couldn't follow along, but I began to pick up on phrases, began to pick up words in the chorus. And you know, most of us, because we've been raised in the church, if we've been raised in the church, been a member of the church for a number of years, we have this deposit here of all kinds of songs, don't we? And we can just sing them on command. We don't need the words, we know them because we've sang them so long, for so many years. I remember on Sunday afternoons visiting with my great-grandmother, and she'd get out the songbook from church, and we would sing songs together. I remember when I was a teenager, and I didn't think it was cool to sing in church. And my mom said to me, you're going to sing anyways. And so I sang. When it comes to praying, it took me a long time to really pay attention when prayers were being uttered. Sometimes I felt like my head was going to explode due to forcing my eyes closed during a really long prayer. I bowed my head and closed my eyes. And eventually I learned to pay attention and not peep at the clock that was on the wall. When it came to giving, my mother always wrote a check, and she always folded the check in half. And guess what? I always fold my check in half, just like she did. Sometimes she would reach into her change purse and she would give me some money, and sometimes she didn't because she didn't have money in the change purse to give to me. I couldn't wait until I made my own money so I could put money in the collection plate. My first job was delivering the newspaper, the Indianapolis Star, and then later I delivered the Indianapolis News. Got up real early in the morning to deliver the newspaper. Would go around. Remember the paper boy used to come to your door and collect? I had to go to the door and collect. And I would take that money and I would take a portion of that and I put it in the collection plate. I was proud that I was able to give. Today, the amount I give is bigger, but my cheerful attitude hasn't changed. Communing. I remember growing up and eating matzo crackers, right? I'd see the matzo crackers go by. The bread and the juice. I watched it go by. I wanted some, but I was told it was only for people who were Christians, people who had been baptized. I remember going to my great-grandmother's house and taking a pie pan and putting saltine crackers in it and pretending like I was taking the Lord's Supper. Any of you remember doing that kind of thing? When I was a week from being 11 years old, I was baptized. And I remember being able to partake of the Lord's Supper that Sunday night. and it's grown in significance through the years. Preaching. When I was little, preaching was the time to draw pictures, right? On the back of the attendance card. It was the time to use a coloring book and draw some pictures, but eventually the pencil and the paper were taken away from me. And it was time to listen hard. My mother would ask me in the car after services, what was the lesson about? Were you paying attention? I would take notes. And then one day I decided I wanted to become a preacher because they only worked one day a week, right? Not really. And then I was baptized. I remember, do you remember? I remember that I had a white sweater vest on. I had a silver clip-on tie. I had on blue pants and a white shirt. I discussed it with my mom. I discussed it with some of my school friends. I was nervous as I walked down the aisle. I remember being handed a card, and I wrote on the card, I want to be baptized. My confession was taken by the preacher, and I remember that blue baptismal garment that zipped up in the back. I felt like I was in the hospital. You know those gowns you have to wear in the hospital? Down in the water and up again. My sins were gone. And I remember saying to Benny, who baptized me, thank you for washing away my sins. These activities and events through the years have shaped me and molded me. And I'm here to tell you tonight, as you have brought your children to church through the years, they're being shaped and they're being molded by the experiences, by all they observe and all they partake in. Those events made me what I am. They have helped nurture my faith. And then finally, tonight, the relationships that the church shares. I think the most educational church events can sometimes be the most informal. Just walking outside after our assembly and fellowshipping in the hallway. I remember Casey had a class when she was at Freed-Hardeman, and she told me about, she had a sociology class with a professor. And he said that when architects design buildings for churches of Christ, they have to design lobbies that are bigger than they are for other denominational churches. Why is that? Because we like to hang around and talk, right? We like to fellowship. A lot of churches, they like to what? Go right out the door, right? But so much is learned when our young people are playing basketball out here, or even they're playing hide and seek and they're laughing and having a good time. I remember work days growing up, canvassing of neighborhoods and having dogs chase you as you're trying to knock on doors. Vacation Bible school and church picnics, helping my mom, who taught for years in Bible school, putting up a bulletin board in her classroom. I remember one Saturday we had a widow in our congregation, and my mother and I went and trimmed her hedges. I'll never forget that. I remember pulling weeds from the church parking lot. I saw faith in people long before I saw it in print. My mother, the elders, Bible school teachers, preachers, youth ministers, college professors, all of these relationships have helped me learn the ways of faith. In Scott Momaday's book, On a Way to a Rainy Mountain, he tells about the time when he was just a child on the Kauai Reservation. His father waked him up early one morning with the words, "Son, it's time to go." Momaday explains, sleepily, I went with my father to the house of an old squaw. My father left me there, and all day long she told me the story of the Kiowa, how we started in the Yellowstone country, and how the tribe grew, and the hunting and the fighting with other tribes. Then the blizzards, the starvation, the coming of the white man, the moving south to Kansas and Oklahoma, and finally the reservations. She chanted the chants, she sang the songs, she told the story. At sunset, my father came and said, "Son, it's time to go." And I left her house a Kiowa. Stories, events, and people. That's the way it's done. That's the way that faith will be passed down to our children. It starts in our homes, and it's nourished by the church. Those of you in particular who teach Bible classes, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I think about all the teachers that I've had through the years, and I think about those of you who teach my children or who have taught my children. Thank you for that, because you have helped nourish what we have tried to develop and grow in our home. And so tonight I ask you this: how is your home? Is your home a place where faith is nourished, a place where faith is developed? How faithful are you in your church life? Are you a Christian tonight? If you're not, obviously that's the first step. I believe this. Every child deserves a Christian father and a Christian mother. And maybe you're a good man or you're a good woman, and no one's doubting that. But if you're not a Christian, if you've not taken on Christ in baptism, there's something lacking in your home. And you need to make that decision tonight for your own sake, most importantly, but also for the sake of your children. If we can assist you in being baptized, if we can pray for you, if we can support you in any way, we're all in this together. Won't you? Please come forward while together we stand and sing to encourage you.